Hello, this is for the Applying Psychological Theories presentation. Title is Building Student Self-Efficacy in the Classroom, Craig Travis, Davenport University. You will see two learner outcomes in the video. The first one is Learner Outcome 1. By the end of this activity, students will be able to identify the ethnic groups that lost land after the Treaty of World War II. The second learner outcome: by the end of this activity, students will be able to describe how the U.S. responded after war broke out in Europe. Both will be used, activities will be used to show the social cognitive theory, specifically the use of building students' self-efficacy in the classroom through watching, through modeling of activities. During the presentation, there are two maps that will be used. The first one here is Europe before World War I in 1914. The second map is World War I, Europe after World War I in 1919. This is the secondary source that will be used during the lesson for modeling of analyzing primary and secondary sources to build student self-efficacy. And here is the actual primary source by Roosevelt and Churchill, used for modeling to show students and assist them in building their self-efficacy. This is the document known as OPVL Document Analysis. It is used to help students build self-efficacy and confidence in analyzing primary, secondary sources through modeling of asking these questions as they analyze the primary and secondary source.
All right, good evening. So we are going to look at, just to give you context, I'm looking at the theory of social cognitive theory, specifically self-efficacy. And so my learner outcomes are based on that in the sense of two activities that involve helping students build self-confidence around using one, which is analyzing maps, charts, and graphs, which is a very important content standard that the state of Michigan says you need to have. And the second one is analyzing primary and secondary sources, and so those are two things. So students today are going to be working with a map, which I will go over in a moment, and a primary and a secondary source for analysis. So, if I were to teach this class and I would be walking in and we would say, okay class, we remember we were talking about World War I and the causes of leading into World War II. So you have our learner outcome is by the end of this activity, students will be able to identify the ethnic groups that lost land after the Treaty of World War I, known as the Treaty of Versailles. So what I did is I gave students two maps. First map is Europe before World War I in 1914. And what it is a political map, so it shows the geographic boundaries for each country prior to World War I. After the war, the boundaries changed. The people who lived in there, the ethnic groups, the nation peoples, actually did not move, but the governments changed. So the goal of this activity is to show students how to compare and contrast by using analysis of maps, charts, and graphs, in color coding, using and showing how the geographic boundary names have changed, but the people who live there have not. And that's going to lead to tensions during what we call the interwar years, which leads to a rise in nationalism, and that is a content standard for history. So, students, if you would like to look at the map, and I'd like you to start with Germany. And as you look at Germany, notice the size of Germany is going to change from World War I to after World War I. I would like you to shade in the differences between the two maps to show this change. So we'll pause it at this point. Okay, so just to recap again, this activity of learning outcome 1 is to color code 2 different maps to show a change in the political boundaries for different ethnic groups before and after World War I. This activity is a challenge for students because even though it's coloring, it's noticing the differences. You're comparing, contrasting. And so this is a good example of the social cognitive theory of building self-efficacy for students, because through modeling and instruction, we can help them to improve on this skill, which is so needed in the state of Michigan. So, Trenton here, what noticing did you have, Trenton, as you were creating your map?
Notice that Finland was never a country until 1919.
Right. So after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Good. And what did you notice, Kristen, about Germany?
Germany definitely got a little smaller after World War I.
Yes.
And Poland developed.
And Poland was created. Good. So as I stated before, this would take about 49 minutes. We would have a lot more discussion around this, but once again, the idea is the teacher models Germany first, and then moves into Austria-Hungary and other countries that existed prior to World War I, and then after World War I, and those changes. And this would be an attempt to encourage self-efficacy and improve that. The second learning outcome has to do with also developing self-efficacy for students, and this is even a more rigorous activity, and this involves using primary and secondary sources. This is very important for AP History. This is important for the IB program for history, and so there's several things I'm asking the students to do. I'm going to model for them something called the OPVL strategy. This is a strategy that is used to help analyze primary and secondary sources. So what the students have is they have two things. They have the OPVL document analysis sheet, and they have a secondary source about World War II and a primary source on the Atlantic Charter. We're going to focus on the Atlantic Charter in this class. If this was a 49-minute class again, the first portion of the class would be going over the secondary source first to give context and background. Then the second point is to look at and understand, as it states here, how the U.S. responded after World War II broke out in Europe by looking at something called the Atlantic Charter. So, as you look at your source, you have several different things on your document analysis sheet. The first thing you have, it says the title of the document. So take a minute and see if you can write down what is the title of the document. Also keep in mind and notice what is the date of the document. So can anyone find the date of the document? Jenna?
1941.
1941. Any specific date in 1941? Do you see anything else?
August.
August of 1941. Do you notice where? So this is what we call the origin. So as we're looking at primary sources, a very important thing for students is to determine the origin of the document. So, who created this document?
The U.S. Department of State.
Okay, where'd you find that?
The bottom.
Good, you found that note. The U.S. Department of State. Good. Who else could have written this document, specifically?
Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill.
Very good. So this is actually a document created by Roosevelt and Churchill in August of 1941. And what you have been reading, Kristen, is the narrative that many times on the AP tests and the IB tests, they always give a little background first, and then the actual document itself is on the back side, which is right here, which is actually the narrative text from the actual charter that they created. Purpose. What is the intended audience? Or who is the intended audience, and what do you think the author's message is? give you a minute to think about that. As you're thinking about that, the other thing for origin I want to make sure we're clear on is we know who created it, Churchill and Roosevelt. Is there anything else we need to know about the authors that would be pertinent to our evaluation?
They were the President of the United States and then was it Prime Minister?
Prime
of
Minister.
Great Britain?
Right. Very good. So they were the heads of state, they were the leaders, and so it gives validity to the document right away. And this is what what I'm doing is what is called a think aloud, and I'm helping students build their self-confidence and self-efficacy on analyzing a primary source, which is very challenging. So let's go down to value. Find a quote from the document that answers this question. What was going on in history at the time of the piece was created, and how does this piece accurately reflect it? Now, this is a challenge because you don't have a lot of time to read it, but there's several different quotes in there that would give real good context for that.
Oh,
If anyone can find one real quick.
it condemned aggression, affirmed the right of self-determination, and endorsed the principles of collective security and arms regulation. No, that's not a good one, sorry. Foundation.
Trenton?
It was several months before the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Very good. So as we're talking about this, as we're looking at this event, this was a meeting in the North Atlantic between Roosevelt and Churchill prior to the U.S. even being involved in World War II. The war was going on in Europe, but the United States was not involved. So putting that in context, that gives value to the document. And what limitations could be on this document? So, meaning, what holes could be in the author's argument?
Like bias? Because it's,
Exactly, bias. Could there be bias in a primary source?
oh yes.
Why?
Because it's simply from the perspective of these two countries in specifics.
Very good. So as we're wrapping up here, we would have a lot more dialogue and discussion around this primary and secondary source, but once again, just to be clear, the purpose of these two learning outcomes is to bring about Bandura's concept of social cognitive theory, and specifically the focus on self-efficacy, building self-confidence through modeling and I believe it's coping modeling as students work together. Thank you.